Hi, welcome to a new Retronaut video. So this video is the next in a series on my own personal tech history. And at this point, we're moving into a new decade. It's 1990, and I'm actually moving away from home for the first time to go to university in Birmingham. I owned an Amiga 500 at this point. I'd had it since its release in October of 1987. And I had quite a lot of kit for it at this point, lots of games, and I was really enjoying my Amiga 500. So as I said in my earlier videos, I was always really a sort of artistic kid. I did have some dabblings with programming, but at this point I decided that I was going to try and do some kind of career in art. And the side of art that I actually enjoyed the most was graphic design or graphic art. An example of that would be the bitmap graphics that you see in a video game, or posters or things like that. I was interested in fine art, but I didn't really want to be I didn't really want to work in it. It was so conceptual at that point, and I was never really a big fan of advertising. And I honestly thought that at this point, fine art was almost a little bit like advertising, and it was mainly about a concept. The art side of it was with a very little a. So yeah, I wanted to go and do graphic design. And what I did was we had a foundation course, which meant that you got to try out lots of different types of art. You could do ceramics and fashion and automotive design as well. You could dabble in that if you wanted to, along with, learning about life drawing and things like that. And the college I was at was really good because it took us on a tour of the Midlands and the north of England. And it took us to all the universities there, or rather, I should say, polytechnics. Because in those days, you couldn't actually do any degrees in practical art. You could do a degree in art history, but you couldn't actually do any degrees in actually doing art, which was a bit bizarre. But that's the way the education system was at that point. The polytechnics, which were basically technical universities, as they were deemed, they were in a transition state, and the government basically agreed that it didn't make any sense to deem them to not be universities because they basically taught people to do things to a degree level. But when I went to Birmingham, it was Birmingham Polytechnic. I decided to go there because Birmingham Polytechnic's graphic design, fashion and furniture design facilities were all on another university's campus, Aston University. And Aston University was a big engineering campus, which is quite strange because, as I said, most technical things weren't allowed to be universities at that point. Anyway, Aston had a very large campus right on the edge of Birmingham city centre. Aston University was quite a wealthy university, has had a lot of investment from engineering companies. And our little faculty at Birmingham Polytechnic was on the edge of that. It was really nice location, right on the edge of Birmingham city centre, so you could get into the city centre and do shopping and enjoy things there. But the actual campus of Aston was very leafy. I think the art campus has moved from there now. But yeah, that's what it was at that time. I had to move away from home for the first time. So from my recollection, I don't think I took my Amiga 500 with me, although I had used animations that I produced on it in my degree interview. And in that interview, there were, I think, 3 course directors, basically people who went on to become my tutors. And you had to show to them, why you deserved to be on the course. And I had a bunch of 2D stuff, graphic design stuff, which I'd done on the foundation course. But I also had a lot of animation done on my Amiga. And this seemed to really impress them that I had such a wide variety of different artwork. And I think it really did help me to get onto that course. So, thanks to the Amiga 500 for that. I moved to a reasonably nice area of Birmingham, actually, called Ward End. And I don't think I really took my Amiga with me at first. And the reason for that was, or even if I did take it with me, I didn't get to use it. And that was because the first year of the course was very busy. Every single day in the first year of my degree course, there was a project. It was a day project. You started in the morning and it had to be finished by the end of the day, which was quite stressful, as you can imagine. You'd start in the morning not knowing what you were going to do, and by the end of the day, you would be marked on it. Also, some of the days they had a two-day project, or sometimes they would even have homework. So I remember one particular project that we did, which was kind of crazy, was they gave us a page from a novel, and they gave us a sheet which had a typeface on it, something like Universe or Garamond or something like that. And they told us to go home and write out that page from the novel in that typeface using a very fine-point pen. It was so much work to do that most of us had to stay up until about 4 o'clock in the morning to do that. So we all turned up in college the next day, all bleary-eyed, and we were very proud of it, what some of us had done. The course directors then said it was really great that we'd learned how to do, let's say, Garamond and how serifs work on the fonts. And they said, okay, now tonight you're going to do a sans serif font. You're going to go and do Universe. So we're all like basically crying. The fact we had to do the same thing all over again, just with a slightly different typeface. But, it was a very good course. It did teach me a lot, but there wasn't really that much spare time in the evenings, to play games or anything like that, really. I think I did listen to music while I was working, but mostly, I was working a lot. So yeah, after a few months, things calmed down a little bit, and I did have some spare time, and I did play the odd game, and I also, carried on experimenting with 3D software. I'd kind of reached a plateau at this point, though, because my Amiga 500, it was only so fast. It only had a 68000 processor, which when it came out was very fast. But by this point, there were faster processors. There was the 68020, 68030, I think, was already out at this point, and I didn't have either of those. Everything was going great, really, in university until the second year. I came back from my summer holidays, and I had to find a new student lodgings to live in. And the reason for that was, I think the original house was being renovated or something, but basically it just wasn't available. So I didn't know the area other than Ward End. So I looked around that area. I think it was on just one day. We had to go to Birmingham just to try and get the lodgings because there was no internet back then. There was no way back in Port Talbot, where I come from, to find, somewhere to live. So we had to go there and look around. And I did find a house. The area wasn't as nice as Ward End. I won't say where it was, but it was a little bit dodgy. I was a little bit worried moving in there. But I thought, well, it doesn't look too bad. But once I'd moved in, after a few weeks, after a few months maybe, it became pretty clear that this was not such a great location. The reason for that is that it was quite dangerous there, really. There was a lot of drug dealing going on. I would come home in the evenings on a bus, and I'd get off the bus and I'd be offered drugs at the bus stop. I think it came to a head after about 6 months when one of the people that was sharing my house, one of the students, they were mugged. And then a couple of weeks later, the other person in the property was mugged. I remember at some point then we were burgled, and luckily my portable television, my color TV, which I used with my Amiga, was strangely left behind. That was very odd. I found it downstairs. But when I went up to my room, I was horrified to find that my Amiga was gone, the power supply, the mouse, nothing else actually. I didn't really have that many games there. Most of them were backups. So really, I didn't lose that much apart from the Amiga itself. But of course, that was very sad. That was a prized possession of myself, which was basically the culmination of going all the way back to the Atari 2600, where I'd saved up money to buy that, and then sold that, and then bought a Commodore 64. And then I bought a Dragon 32. Then I sold that, and then I bought a Commodore 64. And then I sold that, and I got the Amiga. So I'd lost my pot of money, really, that I'd been sort of like shepherding along the way over the following years. I was lucky, though, because I can't remember who said to do it, but it was either my mother or my grandmother, but they suggested that as I move away, that I should get contents insurance just in case something like this happened. So I actually was insured. So that house was just too dangerous at that point. I ended up living there on my own because the other people moved out because it was just too dangerous. We were being mugged and burgled. I mean, that was the end of the line, really. So I moved to the other side of Birmingham, to an area that was better regarded. I asked around in university, and I had, obviously at this point I was living in that flat, so I did have some time to actually talk to people and get an idea where was somewhere nice to live. I think it took a while, but the insurers did pay out, and I got a check, and it was basically the full value of the Amiga, which was great. I think it was like something like £500. So at this point, I had to decide what I was going to do. Was I going to buy another Amiga 500, or was I going to try and buy something better? So I had known about the Amiga 2000. This was the spiritual successor to the Amiga 1000. It was a big box Amiga, and it was designed for professionals. It came out, as far as I know, in March of 1987, and this was just a few months actually before the A500. The A2000, obviously because of its big box, was much more expandable. It had a large case, a very large case, and it had internal slots in it, which were called Zorro 2 slots, and that meant that you could put a large number of expansions into it. I didn't really know that much more about it other than that, but there are actually other expansion slots in this machine which allow you to do a lot more. The A2000 was originally a straight upgrade actually by Commodore Germany. They took the Amiga 1000's chipset and they expanded it basically with a sidecar inside a case. And that was the first version of the Amiga 2000. But this machine apparently turned out to be not that reliable, and it was also limited in that it could only support the same amount of chip RAM as the Amiga 1000 chipset. So that was only 512K of chip RAM maximum. Whereas the A500, it could actually use a megabyte. So soon this was replaced by a new revision of the Amiga 2000, and this actually was based on the A500's chipset, which meant that it could support 1 meg of chip RAM. And apparently, because of the slight modernization in the A500, it was a lot more reliable. The only problem was the A2000 back then cost £2,000. And if you convert £2,000 from then into today's money, it's £7,000, which is a lot of money. There was no way I was going to be able to buy a £7,000, well, a £2,000 computer at the time. As I just said, I had about £500. So yeah, that was quite short of £2,000. But I did have some savings, an inheritance, and I then found out about another Amiga called the Amiga 1500. And that had been launched at £999, so only £500 more than the 500 that I got the insurance money on. Again, that's £3,500 in today's money, so it's still quite a lot of money. But I did have the, luckily, the inheritance. Thank you, Grandad. So I decided to go for a second-hand A1500. And the reason for that was because I actually wanted to upgrade it if I could. I looked around and I bought an A1500, and it actually came with a 68030 CPU and FPU card. I'm not sure if it came with the FPU, but it definitely came with the 68030. An interesting thing about the A1500 was, this is quite an interesting story, Commodore didn't actually make it in the first place. It wasn't their idea, actually. There was a company called Checkmate, and they came up with this very clever idea of producing a case for the Amiga 500. So the idea was that you would get your logic board from your Amiga 500 and the floppy disk and whatever else, and you would put it into this case made by Checkmate. But this was a big problem for Commodore, because if you think about it, they're selling an Amiga 2000, which comes with a hard disk and costs £2,000, a lot of money. And now you can basically buy this case from Checkmate, and you can upgrade your machine to effectively an Amiga 2000 for a lot less money than buying an Amiga 2000. So the A1500, which was the machine that was released, well, the case was called the A1500 from Checkmate. That was a big hit, and it was badly cannibalizing Commodore's own sales on the 2000. But what it actually demonstrated to them was that there was a market segment out there which wasn't being fed. A cheaper A2000, something in between the A500 and the 2000. So Commodore made a deal with Checkmate. They bought out the A1500 project, and then they released a new version of the Amiga 2000, which didn't have a hard disk controller in it, but did actually have two floppy disks. And this machine here, which you'll see is an A2000, because A1500s are actually very hard to find these days. They were only ever made in the UK, and they were only ever sold in the UK, and they don't come on the market very often. This machine is actually very similar to an A1500 in that it was sold with two floppy disks and no hard disk controller. So this is basically an A1500, funnily enough. Yeah, so Commodore released their own A1500. It had two floppy disks and it didn't have a hard disk controller. This got the price down a lot, and basically that was the end of the Checkmate A1500. But it's interesting in that it did actually inspire Commodore to produce a machine of the same name. And funnily enough, there was also an Amiga 2500, which was again a variation on the 2000, and it's using that 500 again to suggest that it's slightly better. So it's interesting that that 500 midpoint in the names was actually used by Commodore in the future. So yeah, it had a 68030 from what I recall. I'm not sure it had an FPU, but I needed to get a hard disk. And the reason for this was I'd been using Apple Macintoshes in college. It was a graphic design course. Apple, basically owned that space in education. And all of the Apple Macintoshes in the lab in university, they all had hard disks, and the operating system was installed on the hard disks and also all the software. So during the day, I was used to trotting up to an Apple Mac, sitting down, and then immediately starting to use it and clicking on icons and doing design stuff. So really, floppy disks, they just weren't going to hack it anymore. So I bought a hard drive adapter and I bought a hard disk. And this would mean that, I could now go to the next level. So my 1500, it did have the Kickstart 2.0 ROMs. So I had my hard disk controller, I put the hard disk in, and then I installed Workbench onto the hard disks. I think it was Workbench 2.0. I remember this very distinctly, installing 2.0 onto those hard disks, and then I got my apps. I owned Vista Pro and Videoscape. I put those on the hard drive as well. And I put various other games as well. I remember, I think, putting my Ultima games onto the hard disk, and that was crazy because now all of a sudden, those games didn't need the floppy disks anymore. So this was my own personal machine, which was the first one I ever had, which actually had a hard drive. And just like the jump from tape on my Commodore 64 to floppy disks, it was like a quantum leap. Basically, it was a complete revelation. It was a different experience. I'd been experiencing it in college, but to have it on my own personal machine at home was amazing. The machine would boot in seconds, and when it did, all of my software was there. So I think my Amiga 1500 was probably my first modern PC-like experience, at least on a machine that I owned. After a while, I wanted to have a better ability to see what I was doing. As I said, I had a portable TV, and you could use that with a modulator to get RF output. But honestly, the quality was terrible. So I very quickly then invested in a monitor. That then allowed me to use higher resolutions on the 1500 because basically on the TV, those resolutions were unreadable. So yeah, the monitor then kind of filled out the package really. So now I had a machine with a hard disk. I didn't have to use floppies anymore, apart from when I was installing software. I had a monitor, which meant I could now use apps at a higher resolution, which made them more professional. And yeah, it was an amazing machine. Yeah, so this, new, much more powerful Amiga meant I could use a machine at home, which was basically the same spec or better than the machines I was using in university. These were mostly older Macs. They were probably 6800 based. Some were 68020. There were a few 68030, and there was one 68040 machine which everybody wanted to use because it was, the fastest and had the most memory. We'll be talking about that in a future video, that particular machine. At home, my 3D rendering continued. I bought a copy of Real 3D. This cost a lot of money. I think it was like 6 or 7. I can't have been. It was I think it was £300 or something like that. It was very, very expensive. And the Real 3D was another ray tracing centric 3D modeler and renderer. And it used the concept that everything in it was solid objects. And you could only really model new objects by using Booleans and things like that to make different shapes. But I had a 68030 in my A1500, and this gave me the speed to make ray tracing viable, though to be fair, it was still pretty slow. So how slow was it? Well, let me give you an idea. Vista Pro on my A1500 might take, let's say, 15 seconds to render a frame on my 68030, whilst a simple frame in Real 3D might take about 30 minutes or 2 hours. It would take hours mainly. The reason for that was that Real 3D was ray tracing only, so it didn't do shadow maps or reflection maps or anything like that. If you had a reflection in an object in Real 3D, it was ray traced, and if you had a shadow, it was ray traced. But to be fair, that's why I got it. I found ray tracing to be fascinating. You know, it was like the next level of 3D. Shadow maps were kind of a hack and still are, and reflection maps is the same thing. And it's only really now in the last couple of years, we're in 2023 now, that we've been able to catch up with that technology in video games. Video games have basically been using shadow maps and reflection maps for the last, nearly 30 years. So yeah, back then, ray tracing was really interesting to me. I was making glass objects and, you know, obsessing over the refraction and things like that. You know, it was kind of next level stuff. I can remember for my degree show, I rendered an animation in Real 3D, and it was about like, I think you had like a video game or something, and it was something to do with Europe. I remember that, and business, and I decided to do an animation of Canary Wharf, which is an area of London with, at that time, it was a new development with new buildings, shiny buildings. So I thought it'd be really cool to do like a ray traced animation flying over Canary Wharf. I think it was taking about 20 minutes a frame, something like that. Although, you know, that was an average. There were some frames that were faster and there were some which were much slower than that. And I think the animation was about 20 seconds long. It could have been longer, but I decided that 20 seconds was long enough. It would take a long time to render. And I did a calculation and it worked out that 20 seconds long, 25 frames a second, because I was using the old television standard back in the UK back then. 25 frames a second was the speed that our televisions worked at. And I thought that would be good enough. And that worked out to be 6 days of rendering solid on the A1500. So I got the animation ready by Christmas of that year. This must have been in maybe 92. And I left for Christmas. I did have house insurance again. I'd learned from my previous experience with the 500 that house insurance was a very good thing. So I obviously couldn't take my A1500 home with me, unfortunately. I didn't have a car, so I had to leave it. So I basically used up that time to render that animation. And I left for the Christmas holidays. And when I came back from the Christmas holidays, it was actually still rendering, which was pretty crazy. I think it took like maybe another day or so, maybe another 2 days, and then it was complete. And I think what's amazing is that the 1500 ran without any bugs and it didn't crash. So yeah, you know, I was very, very lucky that it actually finished that animation, because, you know, 6 days and then it not working would have been pretty tragic. So yeah, well done, 1500. So this machine also allowed me to dabble in multimedia. And this was a concept that was super, super hot at the time. It was developing, you know, I was reading about it in the Amiga magazines. There was software like Scala. And I basically decided to go for a piece of software called Candu. And I'll tell you more about that in a second. So multimedia was this concept of putting together new, what they were called rich media applications, where you could blend together things like images, text, and even animations. And you would have multiple pages and you'd be able to navigate between these pages using buttons and menus and things like that. But the core concept of multimedia was that you combine images, sound, text, and video all together to create a presentation. Now, it's worth remembering that at this time, you know, the web wasn't really a thing. I think it had actually been invented by this point over in CERN in Switzerland, but it was probably still very academic, and it wasn't really used by the general public as far as I was aware. Anyway, it wasn't mentioned in Amiga magazine, so yeah, at that point, Multimedia was all about no connectivity, just pages with media in between them. After a while, Multimedia kind of died out, and the reason for that was the web came along and it kind of took on the mantle of multimedia. And the reason for that was web browsers implemented scripting languages eventually, and that then allowed you to do what these multimedia packages did. Web pages allowed you to show text, they allowed you to show images. They couldn't really show video at that time, so that was a bit of a downside, but the rest of it you could. But you had this very compelling thing where you could go from one page to the next, obviously across the internet. So yeah, that took over the mantle of multimedia. As I said, I bought a package called Candu, and it came with a folder and a very thick manual, and it was, very interesting what it could do. So what could it do? Candu allows you to make pages, and then you can connect those pages together using buttons and menus, as I said earlier. And then these pages could display text, images, and videos, multimedia. I use Candu for my degree show, and I actually put together a presentation with a menu on the front page, and then I rendered out various 3D graphics in Real 3D, and I used those to make a menu. It'd be very interesting if I could find that presentation, but I think it's honestly long gone. But yeah, it was very cool. And then I actually showed that on a dais in my degree show, which, believe me, was incredibly stressful because I had to take my Amiga 1500 with me for my degree show, put it on a pedestal in the room, and then my monitor, and then people would come up and use it and try out this multimedia experience. Candu was also interesting because the Amiga had a language, a scripting language called Rx, and I think this comes from the Unix world. And what it allowed you to do was to script applications. Applications would expose an Rx port, and they would have an Rx parser built in, and they would have a set of commands that they would support. And you could basically write a script and then tell a piece of software like Candu to do something, which was really interesting. Candu allowed you to build custom interfaces. So I had another piece of software called Art Department Professional, or we called it AdPro because obviously it's a very long-winded name. And AdPro was a kind of Photoshop. It was used for processing images, had a much more basic user interface than Photoshop, but it can actually do pretty cool stuff. It could do compositing, you could blend images, you could darken them, lighten them, all the kind of interesting sort of 24-bit color stuff, which had just become available with Photoshop. But, at that time, the Amiga was mainly still living in the index color world. But all of a sudden you had AdPro, and yeah, it allowed you to take two images, turn them into 24-bit color, do color processing on them, combine them, and then output them as a new image. And I used that to process a lot of the images for my degree show, as well as using Photoshop in college. With Rx, I could now control AdPro. So I created a custom interface for AdPro, and I think it was for doing image processing. I think, for instance, the frames that I rendered out from Real 3D for my degree show, the animation, I used AdPro to create a user interface to image process those frames and do something with them. I can't remember what it was. Maybe it was put a logo on them or something like that. AdPro was really, really cool, and I think that's something I'd like to come back to in a future video. Have a look at AdPro and see what it does. It's been a long time, and I'm actually a software engineer these days, so I could probably use it a lot better because I'm a lot better at coding these days. At least I hope I am. What else did I have for my 1500? I also bought an Apple Macintosh bridge card. This was a really cool feature of the Amiga. Was the Amiga 1500 was that it had cards in it which allowed you to use bridge cards to emulate a PC. So somebody obviously decided they could use a similar technology to basically emulate a Macintosh. It was actually easier to emulate a Macintosh because you didn't have to supply the CPU. The CPU on a Macintosh is going to be one of the 68 68,000 processor, at least back then. So it would have been a 68,000, 68020, 68030. My machine already had a 68030 in it. So all the bridge card had to do was get the real ROMs from a Mac, which I did actually have to buy. That was quite expensive from what I remember. Obviously, getting ROMs from a Mac would require probably a broken Mac, so they were pretty rare and therefore quite expensive. But you put those ROMs in the card, and then basically you had a working Macintosh emulated inside your Amiga. It was mostly hardware, so it was actually pretty fast. Not quite as fast as probably a native Macintosh, but very, very close to it. And I used that for coursework, and it became especially useful right towards the end of the course because it became a bit of a frenzy if you went into college. And if you went into the lab to use one of the Macintoshes to do anything there, it was often basically a bit of a queue. I didn't have to do that because I had my Macintosh card at home. I had my monitor so I could see the display nice and clearly. And I even had people from college pop round. I think some of them realized I had this machine, and yeah, some of them would actually pop round to try and do some of their work as well, which was fair enough. I didn't mind them doing that. So yeah, I mean, that was a really cool thing, you know, having not only an Amiga 1500, but I also had an Apple Macintosh in the same box, which was really fantastic. So let's talk about games a bit. At this point on the Amiga 1500, games were still very, very good, but there was a sort of change in the air. 3D games were becoming more and more common. You know, you've got to realize that at this point we'd been basically using 2D engines and 2D graphics since the 1970s. The first games that came out, they used text. And that's because in those days, you know, all of the machines were basically designed around the existing paradigm, which was a terminal with text on it. Even the first micros, well, let's talk about, say, the Commodore 64. That has a terminal-like interface. You type some text, you press enter, it executes the command, you get some feedback. It doesn't have a graphical user interface. The Commodore 64 did have 2D acceleration. It could do sprites. It could do scrolling. But it wasn't designed to do 3D graphics. And that's why on the Commodore 64, there were some 3D games like Elite, and I think there was Mercenary, but it was pretty slow. The Amiga was better than that. Obviously, it had a much faster processor. It was still, you know, doing wireframe 3D graphics. But what you started to see in the early 90s was either shaded 3D graphics. Actually, you did see that earlier on the Amiga as well. But you started to see what I would call pseudo 3D graphics. You know, games like Wolfenstein 3D and Doom. And the Amiga really suffered with those kinds of games. The graphic architecture of the machine just wasn't suited to doing those sort of pseudo 3D games. And those games very quickly translated to be full 3D. Quake, for instance, was a full 3D game where it was using polygons. And yeah, that was when really, you know, the Amiga started to really show its age. So I remember I used to pop into the centre of Birmingham. There was a shop everywhere in the UK in those days, up until about 10 years ago probably, called the Virgin Megastore. These were generally in major cities, you know, Birmingham, Manchester, Cardiff, and they were large media stores. You would go in there and you buy your videos and you would buy your CDs. There was no internet, you couldn't download anything, you had to go and physically buy things. And I'll actually be honest, I liked it. I liked it more than downloading. Downloading is very convenient, you know, you can download anything at any point, but there was something quite fun about having some money and popping into a store and actually, you know, having a day out and going to go and get something and then, you know, clutching it to your bosom and heading back home on the bus, you know, very excited to go off and play this game. So I remember in the Virgin Megastore, I used to look at the Amiga games, obviously, but right next to it on a shelf was another set of games for the IBM PC, what became known as the big box games, and that's because they were in big boxes, you know, about this big. Well, maybe a bit smaller, but there were some really great games coming out on the IBM PC at this time, and I became sort of more and more envious. You know, I knew that things had to move on because, you know, I was looking at games like Ultima Underworld, Dune, Day of the Tentacle, Wolfenstein 3D, you know, all those sort of games. It just looked really wonderful on the IBM PC. And the Amiga just started to look a little bit weak. But, you know, at this point I was using it more professionally. So, you know, I didn't really feel like giving up on it at that point. I was envious of these games coming out on the PC, but there were still some very cool games coming out on the Amiga. So at this point, you know, I decided to stick with my Amiga. That's it for this video in terms of what was going on in my life. I think what we'll do now is we'll take a look at this Amiga 2000 that we have here. So this is the face of my Amiga 2000. It's actually in pretty good condition now. I did a lot of work refurbishing this machine. When I received it, it actually wasn't working, and it required quite a lot of work to actually get it back on its feet. But it's functioning really well now. At least it was the last time I used it anyway. So on the left-hand side, we've got the power LED and the hard disk activity indicator. Underneath, we've got the badge, and this is the original badge, which unfortunately is paper. At some point in the past, somebody's spilled something onto it, so that's not really repairable. I could either replace this with a badge that I print myself or another badge. I've actually bought another badge, and I'm a little bit on the fence about whether I'll use it. It's actually a metallic badge in gold, but I think I'll use it anyway. So let's have a look at the badge itself, actually. So it says Amiga 2000, and it doesn't have anything after it. And I'm not sure about the way they were labeled, but I have seen Amiga 2000s labeled with an Amiga 2000 HD. So this pretty clearly indicates that this was a non-hard disk machine. As we'll see on the back of the machine, there's a label there that actually says 2 floppy disk drives and no mention of a hard disk drive. So this machine actually was pretty much the equivalent of an Amiga 1500. It comes with 2 floppy disk drives, as I said. They are the 3.5-inch variety. And underneath, as you can see, we have a port for a 5.25-inch floppy disk drive, which is the older type of floppy disk that you would have in, well, the Commodore 64 used these, and obviously PCs did for a while as well. Obviously, many other machines too. Underneath there, we have the port for the keyboard. And to the right, we have the 2 ports for the mice or for a joystick. So yeah, quite an attractive machine. Plenty of space on top for a monitor. And yeah, definitely a step up from the Amiga 500. Although actually, I think the Amiga 500 has a nicer industrial design. But it's not an ugly machine. It's definitely quite an attractive machine. And I was, you know, very happy to get my Amiga 1500. So this is the back of the Amiga 2000, at least my one. Let's just quickly run over the areas from left to right. On the left, we've got the video slot backplane, which is currently populated by an RGB to HDMI. We'll go into that a little bit more later. We've got the actual native video connector there. Next to it, we've got the parallel port. And above it, you'll see the label A2000 with 2 floppy disk drives. So that confirms that this was a 2 floppy disk drive machine without any hard disk. To the right of that port is the disk drive port. Then you've got the mono video output, left audio and right audio phonos. And then you've got the serial port. Above this is an internal expansion that I have in my machine, but wouldn't be present in every machine. This is another parallel port, as it says there, no SCSI. Obviously, you've got the power supply here on the left-hand side, and you can see that the labeling is in German. This was originally produced in Germany, but it actually says on the label there that it was manufactured in Hong Kong. So I don't know how much of that is true. Obviously, you've got the on-off switch, the kettle lead plug, a fan outlet from the power supply, and then obviously over here you've got all of the back planes for all of the expansion slots. So you can see it's very much like a modern PC in many regards. So we're actually looking at the right-hand side of the machine. If you're looking at it from the front, there are the 2 floppy disk drives, the cables coming out the back, and you can see that right now I only actually have one of them connected. I think the last time I used this, one of them wasn't very reliable. And as I'm using a Gotek drive in this machine, I don't actually need any floppy disks really, but it's good to have at least one, and I do. Underneath there on the logic board, that's actually where all the RAM for the machine is. So that's actually 1 MB there of chip RAM. Over here, this is the video expansion slot. And this is actually the slot where a video toaster would have plugged in, which was one of the sort of key pieces of hardware you could get for the Amiga range of computers. What that allowed you to do is to use this directly with the television signal and actually overlay the video of the Amiga directly on top of a TV signal. So it was used actually in a lot of TV studios, generally lower end because there were better devices if you had a very large budget. But for a lot of TV stations, even local TV over here, Amigas were used quite extensively. I don't actually need a video toaster because obviously these days we don't work with those signals anymore, so it's pretty much redundant. But what I've actually done here is I've put in an RGB to HDMI card. There's the card there. And then that has a Raspberry Pi plugged into it, and that actually does the heavy lifting, the converting of the video signal. And then there's a HDMI extension lead that comes out of that, and then it comes out of the back plane of the machine. When I bought this, it actually came with a blanking plate with the buttons in it, which is actually really cool. And those buttons allow you to choose certain features of the RGB to HDMI. Then we have the power supply, quite a large one here, but not unusual for a PC or any sort of large box computer of the day. So let's now swap around the view and we'll have a look on the other side. So on this side of the machine, we're actually looking at the Zorro slots and the ISA slots. I believe these are the ISA slots, and I think these are 8-bit and 16-bit ISA here. And up here, you've got the Zorro slot. So actually what you can see here is I've got a card plugged in here, which we'll look at from the other side in a minute. And this is a hard drive card. But these are the expansion slots for your Amiga. And they make it into a very, very flexible machine. At the back, you've got the blanking plates, and then you've got a bar going across, and that's just to give some sort of rigidity to the case. Otherwise, it could flex too much. There's the legend for the actual motherboard. I don't know if you can see there. There we go. Designed in 1988. But I think this machine actually might be a little bit later. This is actually a revision 6.3. And I was very lucky. When I bought this, it was sold as broken. And I didn't actually know what revision of machine it was. I just took pot luck. And it turned up, and I was very, very lucky because it turns out to be a 6.3. That's one of the later revisions. And the reason why I was lucky is because the earlier revisions tend to have a few different issues. Obviously, as the motherboard gets improved upon, things get slightly better. What I can actually do from here is show you the processor slot. So this is actually a specific slot in the Amiga 2000, 3000, and 4000, I think. And it basically allows you to plug in another processor on an expansion card. And this slot has all of the connections to the processor slot. It basically mirrors that. And in this particular revision, it has the ability to turn off the main processor and take over control of the machine. So what I'm actually using here is what's called a Pi Storm. And what that is it's a board which allows you to plug in a Raspberry Pi, and the Raspberry Pi then takes on certain duties in the machine. It emulates the CPU, it emulates a hard disk, it also gives you HDMI output, and you can see there's an extension cable going from there to the back of the machine. I think we saw it earlier. And if you're a purist, then you wouldn't have used one of these. And I am a purist, so why did I use one of these? Well, the problem is that these days expansion cards cost a lot of money because they are the original hardware. They can cost hundreds of pounds. So I thought this was quite an interesting project. I wanted to try it out. It does work great. The only thing I don't really like about it is that it's hard to explain, but the way it emulates a CPU, you can't really tell if it's a 68020 or a 68030 or a 68040. It just sort of emulates a sort of faster CPU. So I find that a little bit unappealing. It's a little bit troublesome. It does run very fast. And because it emulates a hard drive as well, the emulated hard drive is probably the biggest feature of it because it's basically instantaneous. Anything that you load off the SD card, which is in the back here, loads instantaneously. It's pretty amazing. So it's not the experience you would have had back in the day. But yeah, in terms of practicality, it actually does it does quite a few things. So now we can see that really large expansion card from the other side. This was made by a company called IVS, and it is called a Grand Slam. I think you can see in there the ROM. I don't know if you can see on there. I think it says Trump Card Grand Slam. From what I recall, it says Trump Card Pro, but I've seen it actually named as a Grand Slam as well. It's a really cool card. I was very lucky that it came with the machine. When you buy these secondhand Amiga 2000s, it's always, a spin of the wheel as to what you're going to get in them. I didn't get a video toaster. I didn't get a graphics card, but I did get a hard card, which is pretty cool. It came with a quantum hard disk on it, and that would have been in that position there. It's a SCSI adapter, so that's the better type of hard disk technology from back in the day. SCSI had the ability to support, I think it was 8 devices on one bus, and you could chain them together, and it could support lots of different types of devices, scanners, CD-ROM drives, hard disks. Yeah, there were a lot of different things you could actually plug into a SCSI chain. Over here, it has memory, and this particular card can support up to 8 megabytes of memory. So this machine, even without using the PyStorm, has 1 megabyte of chip RAM and 8 megabytes of fast RAM. So it's actually, for the day, a very, very capable machine just with that setup. The native processor, by the way, down in that slot down there where the PyStorm is, that's actually a 68,000 processor. So this machine, without the PyStorm, would just be a 68,000, which is actually pretty slow for for this kind of machine, which is why I got the PyStorm. In the future, I definitely would like to actually get a native expansion card, and I think you can only get up to a 68030 on this machine. I'm not sure about that, but yeah, when the pennies allow, I would like to get a native expansion accelerator card for the CPU on this machine. Let's go back to the Trump card, or the Grand Slam, whichever name you want to use. So what is this here? This is a blue SCSI, and this is a SCSI device emulator. You put in an SD card, and you format it in a particular way, and I think you create a single file on it, which has a number, a name. I think it's like HD0, and then the actual the Zulu SCSI will then take that and emulate a SCSI device. I think it can emulate a number of devices. I'm not quite sure about that, but in my case, I just needed one hard disk or a number of different logical hard disks to store stuff on. It then plugs directly into the Trump card as a SCSI device. And I've got to say, I did have some issues at first getting this working. It worked straight away with the native, the real hard disk there. But with the actual Zulu SCSI, it was a little bit difficult to get working. I did eventually work out how to do it. I can't remember what that process was now. But yeah, this is actually working right now. Why did I use a Zulu SCSI? Well, the original hard disk is from the 1990s, which would mean that it's it's about 30 years old by now. And those drives tend to fail. And what I didn't really want to do was get the machine running, get everything set up, get it perfect, and then the hard drive died. So I decided to keep the hard disk as a spare for now, and to just go with an emulated SCSI device. I think it's actually more practical. It's faster. It's not going to break. And if it did break, you could still take that SD card out of it and plug it into a new Zulu SCSI, and you'd be back up and running. I mean, basically SD cards don't break as far as I know. I don't think they have any reliability issues. So there we go. The Amiga 1500, aka 2000, aka 2500, and probably a lot of other different badges which were put on this machine as well. As we said earlier in this video, it was initially released in 1986, and that initial version turned out to be a little bit problematic. So it went through quite a major re-engineering and was updated quite heavily. And that was the version that most people got after 1987, the B2000 as it was known. The Amiga 2000, 1500, whatever you want to call it, was one of the most successful computers, I think, that Commodore released, at least in terms of achieving its target. And that was to give people an Amiga, a true first big box Amiga that you'd actually do professional work with. I remember getting mine, and as we talked about earlier, a lot of different hardware went into it, accelerator cards to give it a faster CPU, a hard disk, and you could get the video toaster for it, which went on to become a massive part of the Amiga ecosystem, and actually something which it's very much remembered for these days. This machine carried on in use until 1991, which is when it was discontinued. And the reason for that was because around 1990, the Amiga 3000 was released, and that was quite a massive upgrade in the architecture. So yeah, quite a worthy successor actually to the Amiga 2000. I never personally had an Amiga 3000. I've never owned one. They're very expensive these days. They cost about £2,000 generally in the UK. So right now I'm not really in the market for one, but I would love to get an Amiga 3000 and try one out at one point and see what they're like. Yeah, this machine was very expandable, and at the same time, it was also a really good gaming Amiga. When I renovated this machine recently, I put WH load on it, which allows you to load lots of software very easily off hard disk, especially games which were not actually designed to load off hard disk in the first place. And I've tried it out with various games, and it's very, very compatible with older Amigas, just as much really as like an Amiga 500 Plus or something like that. I would say that the big downside to buying an Amiga 2000 these days is that they do tend to have battery damage. If you've ever watched the YouTube channel by Chris Edwards, he's an ex-Commodore employee. He repairs a lot of Amigas, and one of the biggest things that he repairs is Amiga 2000s. There is a battery back clock right here in the machine. It's right next to the CPU. And I don't know if you remember earlier in the photograph that I showed, that battery, when it leaks onto the CPU and will very often damage the traces between that and the ROMs. It can also damage the traces between the CPU slot and the CPU socket, I should say, and the slot which is right next to it for the CPU expansions, and it can stop them from working. I actually had that problem when I bought this machine. It was very, there was a lot of battery damage. And when I got this machine and I first got the power supply working and turned it on, it was a completely black screen. There was nothing going on whatsoever. I then followed the advice of Chris Edwards and various other people on YouTube who done some really useful videos on how to repair these machines. I went through that process very methodically, and pretty soon I had it kind of working. Then I made a few more fixes, and all of a sudden, bang, I had the machine working again. At that point, it was a 68,000 base machine with a 68,000 in the socket. I then bought a Pi Storm, as you've seen earlier, plugged that in, put a Raspberry Pi into it, and then I got the equivalent of what was a kind of 68030, 68040. It's very hard to pin down. That's the only problem with the Pi, I would say. You can't really tell exactly which processor it's meant to be. It's kind of like a 68030, but extremely fast, much faster than a normal 68030. Yeah, wonderful machine. I would definitely recommend anybody out there who loves Amigas to get an Amiga 2000 because there are just so many cards for it. There's just a great ecosystem around it. And even today, people are still making new products for it, new cards. There are a lot of new projects. I guess a lot of budding new electrical engineers and possibly more established older electrical engineers, maybe people who love the Amiga, who are producing either open source projects or they're producing commercial products which can be bought for it, like for instance the Pi Storm. So yeah, it's a really great fun machine. My particular Amiga 2000 still needs a little bit of work. The keyboard connector at the front here and the two joystick ports, they're looking pretty badly corroded. They still work perfectly fine, but there's the potential in the future for those to fail. So I've actually bought some new connectors for those. So at some point, I would actually like to replace those. I am in the market for an actual native original CPU expansion card. There's one which I've seen by GVP, which I would like to get, and that features a 68030 running at 50 megahertz, which is something I don't really remember at the time. But that looks like probably the best expansion I could get for this machine to get it working at the fastest speed while still being an original Amiga spec, you know, without any sort of majorly new items in it. Probably the only thing I would keep, which I don't think really damages the experience, is I would keep the RGB to HDMI, because it just means that this Amiga can not only connect to an old monitor, an original monitor, it can also connect to a HDMI monitor. And I think it's important to keep that, because although I do have an original monitor which will work with this, it's getting old and monitors eventually will fail. There's just no way that they can carry on working because the tubes in them get older and older and eventually completely wear out. So those original monitors will eventually completely fail. So this machine is future-proof because it can actually connect to any modern HDMI monitor, which is great. And the other thing I would probably keep is the Zulu SCSI. Using original hard disks in these retro machines, it is really problematic because they do tend to fail. They are mechanical, and you know, the bearings in them will fail. The heads which move over the disk can actually fail as well. So if you watch any other retro channels where people are using hard disks in these original machines, you'll see time and time again that those hard disks very often turn up not working. In this machine, it was actually working, but in my opinion, it was only a matter of time before it failed. So yeah, I think I've done the right thing by putting a Zulu SCSI in there. I did go the extra yard to actually get it working with an actual real SCSI adapter card. So hopefully when I do get my 68030 original card in here, this machine will actually be quite close to completely authentic, with a couple of concessions to practicality. I'm just really happy with this machine. It was quite a triumph actually when it turned up. This is the first machine which had really extensive damage, which I actually repaired myself and got it working. So there was a real sense of achievement when I managed to do that. You know, when I turned it on originally and it was a black screen, my heart sank. But of course it soared when I actually did manage to get the first flicker. I think at first it was just error colors. And then eventually that magical white screen and then the floppy disk prompt turned up, and I knew that I had a working Amiga 2000. Which took me straight back to my Amiga 1500 days back in 1991. So yeah, that's it for this video. Now, the next video is an interesting one because it's a slight detour from some of the others that we've done in this series, because we're going to look at a machine that I never actually owned, but which had quite a big impact on me because it was probably one of my first experiences of an Apple Macintosh. I did experience the original 1984 Macintosh when I was in college, but in that same lab, there were actually other Macintoshes, and one of them was a Macintosh Quadra. And from what I recall, it was a Macintosh Quadra 700. I don't actually own a Macintosh Quadra 700, but I do have its bigger brother, the 900. And when I say big, I mean big. I'm a little bit worried about getting it down from my storage room because it weighs an absolute ton. So I'm going to have to be careful about my back when I bring it down, but that's what we're going to look at in the next video. Probably a little bit shorter than this one. As I said, I didn't own it, so I can't talk about it at any great length. But I think it's an interesting machine from that era. So yeah, we'll see you in that video. And of course, if you did like this video, please click on the like button. And also please subscribe to the channel, because that obviously will help it to grow. If you don't like the video, then people won't know that it exists, and it won't be shared. And obviously, if you subscribe to the channel, you know about other videos in this series, which I hope you enjoy. So yeah, I'll see you in the next video where we take a look at the Quadra 700. See you then.